The airport buzzed with the usual hum of travelers hurrying past each other, dragging wheeled suitcases and scanning their phones for gate numbers. People were laughing, talking, and rushing to make connections. But for one woman, the noise felt distant. She moved slowly through the crowd, her suitcase rolling silently beside her. It had been a long week, and all she wanted was a moment of quiet, a seat where she could relax and prepare for her journey. She had always loved flying. There was something about stepping onto a plane that felt like leaving the chaos of the world behind, even if only for a few hours. She liked the rhythm of boarding, the way the cabin crew greeted passengers with smiles, and the slight thrill of ascending above the clouds. But today, she carried a quiet anxiety, a feeling she couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was the stress of travel, or maybe it was the lingering memories of being overlooked and underestimated in moments when she should have been seen. As she approached the gate, the boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. She scanned her boarding pass again, confirming the seat number printed neatly in black ink. Everything seemed simple enough. She stepped onto the plane, nodding politely to the flight attendants who welcomed her aboard. The cabin smelled faintly of coffee and new upholstery, a comforting combination that momentarily eased her tension. She walked down the aisle, glancing at the rows of seats on either side. Most passengers were already seated, some chatting quietly, others absorbed in screens or books. She reached her row and slid into her assigned seat. It was a window seat, the one she had carefully chosen when booking, offering a small sense of control and personal space in the often crowded, impersonal world of air travel. She set her bag under the seat in front of her and exhaled slowly, allowing herself a brief moment of relief. But that relief was short-lived. A few moments later, a voice came over the intercom, calm but firm. "Ma'am, could you please move to another seat?" She froze. Her heart skipped a beat. She had expected routine instructions about safety or luggage, but not this. She looked around, startled, and then back at the flight attendant standing in the aisle. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with surprise. "May I ask why?" The flight attendant hesitated, glancing at the pilot, who was now visible at the front of the cabin, his expression unreadable. "It's just we need you to switch seats," the attendant said. "It will make things easier for the flight crew." She shook her head, trying to keep her composure. Something about the tone didn't sit right with her. There was no explanation, no mention of weight distribution, no practical reason at all. Just a demand, polite on the surface but commanding underneath. She glanced at the passengers around her. Some were looking curiously, a few with subtle frowns, and others pretending not to notice. "I'd like to understand why before I move," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was a firmness beneath it, a quiet insistence that she would not comply without reason. The flight attendant swallowed, avoiding eye contact. "It's just best if you move," she said again, her voice softer this time, as if trying to coax compliance. The woman's mind raced. She had flown hundreds of times, and this was unusual. No one had ever asked her to give up a seat she had specifically booked. Something about the request felt wrong, unfair, and instinctively, she knew it wasn't just a simple logistical issue. She looked down the aisle at the pilot, who was watching from the cockpit doorway, arms crossed, expression neutral but unreadable. The woman took a slow breath, steadying herself. She had been in situations before where she had been overlooked or dismissed, but she had learned to hold her ground, to assert herself calmly and with dignity. This was one of those moments. She wasn't sure what the consequences might be, but she knew she couldn't let herself be pushed aside without question. "I'm happy to cooperate with the crew," she said, her voice polite but resolute. "But I'd like to know the reason for this request. I'm not moving just because someone asks me to." A ripple of murmurs passed through the cabin. Passengers shifted in their seats, curious now, sensing the tension. Some leaned forward slightly, trying to catch fragments of the conversation. Others looked away, pretending they weren't listening, but their attention betrayed them. The atmosphere was subtle but charged, a quiet anticipation that made every small sound, the rustle of a bag, the click of a seatbelt, feel louder than usual. The flight attendant looked uncomfortable. She glanced back at the pilot, who now raised a hand slightly, gesturing for patience. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm but firm, "it's just easier if you move. Please." The woman shook her head again. "I understand your request," she said, her tone measured. "But I need a reason. There's a difference between convenience and fairness. I'd like to know which this is before I comply." The pilot frowned slightly, clearly not expecting resistance. He hesitated, and in that moment, the woman felt a surge of quiet satisfaction. She had taken a stand without raising her voice, without creating a scene, and yet the authority she projected was unmistakable. It wasn't loud or aggressive. It was composed and unwavering. The cabin had gone almost silent. Even the low hum of the engines seemed to fade into the background as passengers watched the exchange. Some leaned slightly forward, intrigued. Some whispered quietly to each other. The woman could feel the weight of their attention, but she didn't falter. Her eyes met those of a few passengers near her row. There was a mixture of curiosity, sympathy, and admiration. Time seemed to stretch. The flight attendant shifted from foot to foot, uncertain. The pilot's expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in his posture that hadn't been there before. He opened his mouth to speak again, then paused. The woman held her breath, waiting, her hands resting lightly on her bag. She felt her pulse quicken slightly, but she kept her composure, reminding herself that she was in control of her own actions, even if the situation felt unfair. She remembered her training, her experience in professional environments where calmness under pressure made all the difference. She had learned that standing firm, even in the face of authority, was not just about courage. It was about clarity, about making sure every action was deliberate, measured, and respected. She would not move simply because someone demanded it. She would move when it made sense and when it was fair. Another wave of murmurs passed through the cabin. A few passengers shifted in their seats, whispering, exchanging glances. One elderly man shook his head slightly, frowning at the pilot. A young woman tapped on her phone, presumably documenting what she saw. The tension was palpable, but the woman remained steady, an island of calm in a storm of quiet curiosity. Finally, the pilot sighed, clearly frustrated but unwilling to escalate the situation further. He stepped back slightly, giving her space, and gestured to the attendant to handle it. The woman sat quietly, waiting, knowing that this was only the beginning. Something in the air suggested that the story was far from over, that there was more to come, and she needed to be prepared for whatever happened next. She settled back into her seat, still alert, her mind racing with possibilities. She knew that sometimes, courage wasn't about grand gestures or loud confrontations. It was about maintaining dignity, asking questions, and refusing to be dismissed. And as the plane prepared for takeoff, she felt a quiet determination. She didn't yet know how the day would unfold, but she knew that she wouldn't let herself be silenced or ignored. As the engines roared to life and the plane began to taxi toward the runway, the woman glanced out the window. The city stretched beneath her, full of life and movement, a reminder of the world she navigated every day. She adjusted her seat slightly, keeping her bag close, and exhaled slowly. The journey ahead would be challenging, but she was ready to meet it head-on. And somewhere deep inside, she sensed that the events unfolding in this small, crowded cabin would leave a lasting impression. Not just on her, but on everyone who witnessed them. The hum of the engines rose, the plane rolled forward, and the woman sat quietly, alert but calm. The tension in the cabin was still there, a silent current running through the passengers, but she held herself with quiet authority. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew she had already set the tone. She had shown, without words of anger or confrontation, that she would not be pushed aside. And in that small, determined act, the first ripple of something extraordinary had begun. The story was only starting, but already, the passengers sensed that this flight would be remembered for more than its destination. Something unusual, something remarkable, was unfolding. The plane had lifted off, the city shrinking beneath a layer of clouds, Yet the tension inside the cabin did not ease. The woman remained in her assigned seat, straight-backed and calm, but her mind raced. She could feel the weight of stares from passengers who had sensed the unusual confrontation earlier. Some looked at her with curiosity, some with quiet admiration, and a few with skepticism, as if silently asking whether she would back down. The flight attendant returned to her side, offering a polite smile that did little to hide her discomfort. "Ma'am, really, it would make things easier if you moved," she said again, softer this time, as though trying to coax compliance rather than demand it. The woman took a deep breath. She had been in situations like this before, where authority assumed she would simply obey, and fairness was considered optional. But she had learned that remaining silent in the face of that kind of pressure only gave others power. She shook her head, keeping her voice calm. "I understand that it may be easier for the crew," she said, "but I still need a proper explanation before I move. There's a difference between convenience and necessity, and I'd like to know which this is." The attendant looked uneasy, glancing toward the cockpit. The pilot's figure appeared in the doorway again, arms crossed, a tight expression on his face. He spoke, his voice measured but carrying a subtle authority. "We just need you to move. It's not a big deal. Please cooperate." The woman's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in focus. She could feel her pulse quicken, not out of fear, but from the adrenaline of standing her ground. "With all due respect," she said, "it is a big deal if I am being asked to give up a seat I booked without a clear reason. I am not refusing to cooperate. I am asking for clarity. Is this about safety, logistics, something else?" The cabin seemed to hold its collective breath. A few passengers shifted in their seats, whispering to one another. The murmur was quiet but noticeable. People were curious now, sensing that this was more than an ordinary disagreement over seats. There was something charged about the moment, and the woman felt it in the air, a silent anticipation that made every small sound. The hum of the engines, the rustle of a bag, the click of a belt, feel louder than usual. The pilot frowned. His face was calm, but his posture was tight, like someone holding back frustration. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "I'm just asking you to move. It will make things easier for the cabin crew. That's all you need to know." The woman shook her head, her voice firm but controlled. "That's not all I need to know. I am asking because there is a principle at stake here. It's not about comfort. It's about respect and fairness. I would like an honest answer before I comply." A few passengers looked around, whispering softly to each other. Some gave small nods, as if silently supporting her stance. Others leaned back in their seats, pretending not to notice, but their curiosity betrayed them. Even the flight attendants nearby were now paying attention, their expressions a mixture of concern and uncertainty. The cabin, once just another routine flight, had become a stage for something far more human, an unexpected test of authority, courage, and integrity. The attendant cleared her throat, visibly struggling with what to say. "Sir," she said to the pilot, "maybe we should just—" She trailed off, unsure how to continue. The pilot opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. He seemed caught between insisting on authority and avoiding a scene. The woman noticed the hesitation, but she did not press further. She knew that pushing too hard could escalate things unnecessarily. Instead, she sat upright, her hands resting lightly on her lap, projecting calm confidence. She had learned that in moments like this, composure was more powerful than confrontation. For a few long minutes, there was silence. The only sounds were the low hum of the engines and the occasional rustle of a newspaper or magazine. The tension was subtle but pervasive, like an invisible thread stretched tight across the cabin. Every passenger seemed to feel it, some leaning forward slightly, others fidgeting in their seats. The woman felt their eyes on her, but she did not look around. She focused on her breathing, on staying grounded. She did not need anyone's approval. She only needed clarity and fairness. Finally, one of the passengers, a middle-aged man sitting across the aisle, leaned slightly forward. "Excuse me," he said, his voice quiet but earnest. I don't know the details, but it seems like she's right to ask questions. No one should be asked to move without a reason. A ripple of murmurs followed. The woman gave a small, appreciative nod. She felt a surge of gratitude, not for being supported, but for the reminder that standing up for oneself could resonate with others in ways that words often could not. The cabin seemed to shift slightly, the atmosphere charged not with anger but with awareness. The pilot spoke again, his voice low, trying to assert control without escalating further. "Ma'am, I'm asking you once more. Please move. It will make things easier." The woman met his gaze steadily. "I am not moving simply because you ask. I need a valid reason. I respect the crew, and I am willing to cooperate, but I will not comply with a vague demand that feels unfair." A few passengers shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension but unsure how to react. The murmurs grew a little louder. The young woman near the back of the cabin began typing rapidly on her phone, her fingers moving faster than her eyes, probably documenting what she saw. Others glanced at each other, whispering quietly. The atmosphere was no longer casual. It had transformed into a shared moment of quiet drama, something subtle yet powerful that made the ordinary act of flying suddenly extraordinary. The attendant glanced at the pilot again, hesitating. "Sir," she said softly, "maybe we should just let her stay." The pilot's jaw tightened, but he did not respond immediately. He seemed to be weighing his options, calculating the consequences of insisting further versus letting the matter go. The woman remained still, projecting calm authority. She was not seeking a fight, but she was also not willing to surrender her dignity or sense of fairness. A few moments passed. The woman could feel the tension in the cabin like a tangible force. She noticed the subtle shifts in body language, the tightening of hands, the leaning forward of curious passengers, the exchange of whispered comments. She understood that this was no longer just about her seat. It had become a silent question to everyone in the cabin. What was right, what was fair, and who had the courage to stand up calmly for both? Finally, the pilot spoke, his voice slightly quieter, though still firm. "Ma'am, if you do not move, I will have to escalate this with higher authorities." The woman's eyes remained steady. She did not flinch. "I am prepared for that," she said evenly. "I am not moving without a valid reason, and I am willing to have this situation reviewed. I am not resisting authority, I am asking for fairness. That is all." A hush fell over the cabin. Even the flight attendants nearby seemed momentarily frozen, unsure how to proceed. The passengers were silent, watching, sensing that something significant was unfolding. The woman felt the energy in the cabin, the quiet curiosity and tension, but she did not let it distract her. She had faced moments like this before, moments where the balance of respect and authority hung in the air, delicate and precarious. She thought of the people who had doubted her in the past, the times when her skills or position had been overlooked because of assumptions or appearances. She felt no anger, only a calm determination. She knew that standing firm in moments like this was not about proving anyone wrong. It was about asserting what was right, quietly and without drama. Passengers whispered softly to each other, some nodding subtly, others still unsure. The air in the cabin was thick with anticipation, like a calm before a storm, though the storm would not be loud or violent. It would be measured, deliberate, and revealing. And the woman knew that whatever happened next, it would change the energy on the plane. The pilot took a slow breath, clearly considering his next words. The woman remained composed, her hands resting lightly on her lap, her gaze steady, projecting a quiet confidence that seemed to ripple through the cabin. She did not need anyone to cheer her on. She only needed to remain clear, calm, and grounded. The murmurs subsided slightly as passengers leaned back, watching silently. Some exchanged glances, as if silently acknowledging her courage. The young woman typing on her phone paused, looking up, curious to see what would happen next. The cabin crew shifted uncertainly, caught between following protocol and responding to the undeniable presence of authority that the woman projected. And in that quiet tension, the woman sensed that the moment had reached a turning point. She had asked for fairness. She had asserted her rights without aggression, and she had captured the attention of everyone around her. What happened next would reveal more than just the resolution of a seating dispute. It would reveal character, integrity, and the unexpected ways authority could be recognized and respected. The woman leaned back slightly, calm but alert, feeling the weight of the cabin's attention. She had no doubt that the situation was far from over, but she also knew that she had already set the stage. Whatever unfolded next, she was ready. She did not need to act rashly or angrily. She only needed to remain composed and let the truth, fairness, and her own quiet authority guide the outcome. The cabin had grown quiet, each passenger acutely aware of the tension that had settled like a weight in the air. The engines hummed steadily, but they no longer seemed enough to distract from the unease that lingered row by row. The woman remained in her seat, calm on the surface, but her mind raced with the knowledge that she was on the brink of a turning point. She had asserted her right to fairness, and now it was time to take the next step. She reached slowly into her bag, her hands steady. Every eye in the cabin seemed to follow her movement, although no one said a word. She withdrew a slim case, opening it carefully to reveal a badge that gleamed in the cabin light. It was small but unmistakable, official, and it carried authority that was suddenly impossible to ignore. She held it up for a moment, letting it catch the attention of the pilot and crew before lowering it to her lap. The silence was profound. Passengers leaned forward, their curiosity palpable. Some gasped quietly, others exchanged glances, whispering to one another, but all were riveted. The woman's presence had always been composed, confident, but the badge added a new layer, an undeniable proof of authority that changed the dynamic instantly. The pilot, who had been standing in the cockpit doorway moments before, froze. His face was calm, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, a recognition of the situation that hadn't been there before. He stepped back slightly, arms crossing defensively, his earlier firmness giving way to uncertainty. The woman's calmness now carried weight, legitimacy, and a quiet power that filled the cabin. She leaned slightly forward, speaking in a voice that was steady, measured, and perfectly calm. "I am willing to cooperate fully with the crew and follow all rules," she said. "But I will not move without cause, and I expect to be treated with the same respect and fairness that every passenger deserves. This badge confirms my role in ensuring safety and protocol is followed. That is not negotiable." The flight attendant near her row shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the pilot as if asking silently what should be done. The murmurs from passengers grew slightly louder, but there was no chaos, just a shared awareness that something significant was unfolding. Some of the crew members whispered to one another, checking protocol and their own understanding, while others glanced at the badge with newfound respect. The pilot cleared his throat, his voice controlled but careful. "Ma'am," he said, "I wasn't aware. I didn't realize your position." The woman nodded slightly, keeping her voice calm but firm. "I understand that you may not have known. That's why I asked for clarity. I'm not here to cause trouble or make demands. I am here to ensure that proper procedure is followed." A subtle tension lingered, but the power dynamic had shifted. The pilot no longer had the unquestioned authority he had assumed when he first asked her to move. Every passenger now understood, even without knowing the details of her role, that this was not a personal dispute. It was a matter of procedure, fairness, and rightful authority. She could feel the eyes of the cabin on her, curious and attentive. Some passengers nodded slightly, as if silently acknowledging her composure and courage. The murmurs continued, but they were no longer filled with speculation about conflict. They were filled with admiration and curiosity, a quiet energy that seemed to hum through the cabin. The pilot's tone softened, no longer commanding but measured. "I apologize if my request caused any discomfort," he said. "We were unaware of your position, and I appreciate your patience. Of course, you may remain in your seat." The woman nodded, a small but dignified acknowledgement. She lowered the badge slightly, careful not to brandish it unnecessarily, but she had made her point. The cabin's energy shifted again, this time from tension to quiet respect. The passengers sensed that a moment of composure and authority had just occurred in real time, something rare and human that went beyond the ordinary flight experience. Some of the passengers whispered among themselves, noting the courage and poise the woman had shown. One man near the window leaned toward his companion, murmuring, "I've never seen anyone handle a situation like that so calmly." A woman too rose back, nodded, holding her coffee cup tightly, watching in fascination. The atmosphere had transformed from unease to quiet admiration. The flight attendant returned to the woman's side, now with a more relaxed posture. "Thank you for your patience," she said. "We appreciate your cooperation." The woman smiled faintly, still calm but aware of the cabin's eyes on her. "Of course," she replied. "I just ask that all passengers are treated fairly and respectfully. That's all I expect." The pilot gave a curt nod and returned to the cockpit, clearly adjusting to the new dynamic. The hum of the engines seemed to fill the cabin once more, but the tension had lifted slightly, replaced with a subtle energy of respect and attention. The woman settled back into her seat, keeping her hands in her lap, maintaining her calm. She did not seek recognition, but she could feel the acknowledgement in the eyes of those around her. For the first time in the flight, she allowed herself a small exhale of relief. She had faced the situation with composure, asserted her rights, and maintained respect for the crew, all while commanding attention without aggression. It was a delicate balance, one she had learned through experience, and it had worked. The cabin seemed lighter now, the air less charged, though the story of what had happened would linger in everyone's mind for the rest of the flight. Passengers whispered quietly, sharing impressions and theories about the unfolding events. The murmurs were curious and respectful, a subtle hum of shared fascination. Some of them glanced at their phones, perhaps considering posting about what they had witnessed, though none wanted to disrupt the calm that had settled. The woman could sense the ripple effect her actions had created, a quiet but undeniable impact on those around her. She looked out the window briefly, watching the clouds drift past in soft layers of white. The sight was calming, a contrast to the heightened awareness inside the cabin. Flying had always brought her peace, and now, after asserting herself and setting the record straight, she felt a renewed sense of control and confidence. She had turned an uncomfortable situation into a demonstration of integrity, patience, and quiet strength. A few passengers leaned slightly toward each other, whispering about the badge and her composure. "Did you see that?" one said softly. "She didn't yell or argue. She just handled it." Another nodded, eyes wide. "I can't believe how calm she stayed. And that badge. It really changed everything." Even the younger flight attendants who had been observing from nearby seemed impressed. They exchanged glances, taking mental notes about how authority could be asserted respectfully, and how calm composure could defuse potential conflict. The woman had done more than assert her rights. She had demonstrated an unspoken lesson about dignity, fairness, and self-assurance. The pilot returned briefly to the aisle, checking on passengers and cabin systems. His eyes met hers for a moment, and there was an unspoken acknowledgement in that glance, a recognition that the situation had been handled with professionalism and calm. There was no animosity, only an adjustment of understanding. The power dynamic had shifted, not through confrontation or anger, but through quiet clarity, calm, and authority backed by legitimacy. The woman leaned back slightly, allowing herself to feel the relief that had been building since the initial confrontation. She did not gloat, nor did she seek validation from the passengers or crew. Her satisfaction came from knowing that she had done what was right, maintained her composure, and ensured fairness without escalating tension unnecessarily. The murmurs around her continued, but they were soft, filled with curiosity and admiration rather than concern or judgment. The cabin had transformed from a place of unease to one of quiet respect, each passenger now aware of the importance of integrity, composure, and standing up calmly for oneself. The woman adjusted her seatbelt, keeping her posture straight and confident. She allowed herself a moment to observe the passengers around her. Some were whispering softly, exchanging glances, and sharing impressions. Others were watching her with quiet fascination, impressed by the manner in which she had handled the situation. There was a sense of shared understanding in the cabin, a collective acknowledgement of courage that did not require applause or loud recognition. As the plane cruised above the clouds, the woman remained alert but calm. She knew that the next stages of the flight would be routine, but the energy in the cabin had shifted. Her quiet assertion of authority and fairness had set a tone, one that passengers and crew alike would carry with them, a subtle but lasting impression. The hum of the engines, once merely background noise, now felt almost like a steady pulse beneath the extraordinary human drama that had unfolded. Every movement, the rustle of a bag, the soft click of a seatbelt, the low murmur of conversation, felt amplified against the backdrop of what had just happened. The woman's presence had changed the energy in the cabin, and the passengers sensed it, even if they could not articulate it fully. She glanced briefly at the badge, tucked carefully back into her bag. It was not a symbol of pride, but a tool of legitimacy, a reminder that authority carried with it responsibility and accountability. She had wielded it calmly and effectively, without arrogance or unnecessary force, and the result was immediate and unmistakable. The cabin had recognized her authority, the pilot had adjusted, and the atmosphere had shifted from tension to quiet respect. The woman allowed herself a small, satisfied smile, though she did not draw attention to it. She had maintained control of the situation without confrontation, and in doing so, she had turned what could have been an uncomfortable or embarrassing moment into a demonstration of composure, fairness, and human dignity. The plane moved steadily, the city far below now obscured by a blanket of clouds. The woman leaned back in her seat, hands resting lightly on her lap, feeling the calm that comes after a storm has passed. She knew that the story of this flight was far from over, that other moments would come, but she was ready. She had faced the challenge with poise, ensured fairness, and set a tone of quiet authority that would resonate long after the engines had stopped humming. And as passengers whispered softly, exchanged glances, and watched her with admiration, she understood that this moment had become more than a personal victory. It had become an example of courage, dignity, and quiet strength for everyone aboard. The cabin had settled into a quiet rhythm after the badge reveal, but the woman remained alert. She knew the situation wasn't fully resolved. She had asserted her authority. Yes, but now it was time to ensure that fairness and proper procedure were truly recognized. The pilot had acknowledged her position, yet there was still an underlying tension, a subtle hesitation in his demeanor that suggested he was struggling with the shift in dynamics. She straightened in her seat, her posture calm and composed, projecting a quiet confidence that seemed to ripple through the cabin. Passengers continued to watch, some leaning slightly forward, others exchanging whispers that carried admiration more than gossip. The woman was acutely aware of their attention but did not allow it to distract her. She had learned long ago that moments like this were not about spectacle. They were about clarity, composure, and ensuring that the right thing was done, regardless of who was watching. The pilot returned to the aisle, glancing briefly at the passengers, then back toward her. His expression was careful now, measured. He had realized that insisting on her moving seats would no longer be simple, that her calm authority had shifted the balance. "Ma'am," he began, his voice low and respectful. "We want to ensure the comfort and safety of all passengers. I understand your position, and I apologize for the earlier request." The woman nodded slightly, keeping her voice steady and calm. "Thank you," she said. "I am not here to challenge anyone personally. I am only asking that proper protocol be followed and that fairness be maintained. That is all I expect." The murmurs among passengers quieted as the pilot paused, clearly taking a moment to consider his next words carefully. The cabin crew moved with a new sense of respect, attending to passengers efficiently, but with more awareness than before. The woman's presence, her calm authority, and the simple act of asking for fairness had shifted the energy on the plane. For the next few minutes, she observed the subtle changes around her. A flight attendant adjusted a bag overhead and smiled politely at a passenger she had previously seemed impatient with. Another attendant nodded toward the pilot, perhaps confirming that the situation was under control. Passengers who had been whispering before now seemed more relaxed, though still quietly intrigued by what had occurred. It was as if the cabin itself had taken a collective breath. The woman allowed herself a small, quiet exhale, though she remained fully alert. She knew that ensuring fairness was more than just holding her seat. It was about confirming that the rules and procedures applied equally to everyone. She wanted to make certain that no passenger or crew member would feel pressure to act unfairly again, that this small but significant lesson would carry beyond the immediate moment. The pilot stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Ma'am, I understand your role now. We will follow the proper procedures. Please, remain in your seat." She nodded, a small, composed gesture. "I appreciate that. Thank you." She felt a subtle relief but did not relax completely. She had learned that true resolution often required continued attention, especially when authority and fairness were at stake. As the plane continued to cruise smoothly above the clouds, she noticed how the other passengers had changed their behavior. Some leaned slightly back in their seats, exchanging quiet nods or whispers that reflected respect rather than idle curiosity. Others were simply watching, paying attention to the interaction, perhaps learning something about standing firm with dignity and composure. The woman felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that her actions had influenced the cabin in this way. The flight attendant returned to her side, this time with a calm smile. "Everything is under control now," she said. "We appreciate your patience and your cooperation." The woman responded politely, "Thank you. I just ask that everyone is treated fairly and respectfully. That is all I expect." There was a pause as the attendant nodded, acknowledging her words. The cabin had transformed from one of tension and uncertainty to one of calm attentiveness. The passengers seemed to recognize that a significant moment had occurred, though they could not fully articulate why. There was a shared understanding that fairness, composure, and quiet authority could have a powerful impact, even in such a small, contained space. The woman leaned back slightly, still alert but calm. She glanced around the cabin, observing the passengers and crew. Some were whispering softly to one another, while others simply sat, watching, absorbing the quiet lesson that had unfolded before them. The energy had shifted. It was no longer charged with tension, but with respect and awareness. She reflected on the events of the flight so far, realizing that asserting her authority had been necessary not just for herself, but for everyone in the cabin. The simple act of standing her ground, asking for fairness, and presenting her badge had altered the dynamic completely. It was a reminder that calm, measured actions often speak louder than confrontation, and that integrity has a way of revealing itself naturally when circumstances are challenging. A young woman a few rows back whispered to her companion, "Did you see how calm she stayed? She didn't argue or shout, and the pilot listened. That was incredible." The companion nodded, eyes wide. "I know. I've never seen someone handle a situation like that so gracefully. And that badge, it completely changed everything." Even the cabin crew seemed affected. One attendant adjusted a passenger's overhead bag and smiled politely, while another whispered something to a colleague, likely commenting on the composure the woman had displayed. The pilot, too, had shifted, moving more carefully through the aisle and consulting with crew members in a subdued tone. The power dynamic had been fully acknowledged, and now the challenge was ensuring the resolution was recognized and maintained. The woman kept her posture straight and composed, aware that the final stage of the situation required patience and attentiveness. She did not need to act aggressively or demand compliance. Her calm presence and the acknowledgement of her authority were enough. The flight had become an unspoken demonstration of the quiet power of fairness, composure, and self-assuredness. Minutes passed, and the woman continued to observe the cabin. Passengers seemed more relaxed now, yet the memory of the confrontation lingered. Some whispered quietly, recounting what had occurred, while others watched silently, still absorbing the subtle tension that had transformed into respect. The woman felt a sense of quiet pride, though it was tempered by awareness. She had done what was necessary, but she remained vigilant, knowing that true resolution required sustained attention. The pilot returned once more, this time with a calm but serious expression. He spoke quietly to the cabin crew, and then addressed the woman directly. "Ma'am, I apologize again for the earlier situation. We will ensure that all procedures are followed properly, and that all passengers are treated fairly throughout the flight. Thank you for your patience and for handling this with such professionalism. The woman nodded, a composed but gentle acknowledgement. Thank you. That is all I ask. The cabin seemed to exhale collectively. The earlier tension, thick and almost tangible, had lifted. Passengers returned to their activities, some reading, some quietly chatting, but with a new awareness that the events they had witnessed were significant. It was a subtle lesson in respect, fairness, and the quiet power of maintaining composure under pressure. The woman allowed herself a small smile, though she did not draw attention to it. She had not sought recognition. Her satisfaction came from knowing that she had acted with integrity, upheld fairness, and maintained composure in a situation where many might have faltered. The cabin had observed, absorbed, and learned in its own way. She glanced at her badge, now safely tucked back into her bag. It was not a symbol of pride but a tool of responsibility, a reminder that authority carried with it the duty to act fairly and responsibly. She had wielded it calmly and effectively, ensuring that proper procedure was followed and that the situation was resolved without confrontation. The engines hummed steadily beneath her, a comforting and steady presence. She leaned back slightly, allowing herself a moment of quiet reflection. The events of the flight had reminded her of something she already knew, that fairness, composure, and quiet authority could transform a moment, influence others, and create respect without aggression or loud confrontation. Passengers continued to whisper softly, exchanging glances and impressions, but the tone was no longer tense or uncertain. It was respectful, curious, and quietly admiring. The woman felt a subtle satisfaction, knowing that she had not only resolved her own situation, but had created a ripple of awareness and respect that would likely linger for the remainder of the flight. She adjusted her seat slightly, keeping her hands resting calmly in her lap, and observed the passengers around her. Some continued to whisper softly, recounting the earlier events with fascination. Others watched quietly, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and admiration. The energy in the cabin had transformed completely, from tension to quiet respect, and the woman had been the catalyst. As the plane continued its journey, cruising steadily above the clouds, the woman allowed herself a quiet sense of relief. She had asserted her authority, maintained her composure, and ensured fairness, all while influencing the cabin in subtle but undeniable ways. The situation was no longer tense. It was resolved, and yet the memory of the moment would linger in everyone's mind. The flight continued smoothly, but the story of what had occurred was far from ordinary. The woman had demonstrated, in real time, that calm, measured actions, backed by knowledge and integrity, could alter dynamics, create respect, and resolve tension without conflict. She had transformed a moment of discomfort into a demonstration of quiet power and dignity, and the cabin had witnessed it all. And as the plane hummed steadily through the sky, the woman sat composed, aware that the resolution she had created would resonate long after the engines stopped, leaving a lasting impression on everyone who had been aboard. The plane began its descent, the clouds parting to reveal the city below in soft patches of sunlight. The passengers, once tense and uncertain, now moved with a quiet awareness. Some looked out the window, taking in the view with renewed calm, while others whispered softly, still replaying the events that had unfolded on the flight. The woman remained seated, composed and alert, though a subtle satisfaction shone in her expression. She had handled the confrontation with the pilot, asserted her authority with clarity and dignity, and ensured that fairness had been recognized. Now, as the plane approached the airport, she allowed herself to reflect on the ripple effect her actions had created. The cabin had transformed, almost imperceptibly, from tension to respect, and she could feel that her calm, deliberate approach had left a lasting impression on those who had witnessed it. The flight attendants moved through the aisles with ease, securing luggage and checking passengers for seatbelt compliance. Their demeanor had shifted from cautious and uncertain to attentive and confident. The earlier conflict had been a test of composure for everyone on board, and they now moved with the quiet understanding that calm authority, when exercised with fairness, commands respect naturally. Some passengers whispered to one another, recounting what had occurred. "Did you see how composed she stayed?" one said quietly to a companion. "I've never seen someone handle a situation like that so calmly." Another nodded, eyes wide. "And the badge? It made everything clear. She didn't have to raise her voice at all." The woman noticed these reactions, though she did not respond outwardly. She had never acted for recognition or applause. Her satisfaction came from knowing that she had done what was right, maintained her dignity, and ensured fairness without creating unnecessary conflict. That was enough. She had influenced not just the pilot and crew but the passengers as well, showing the quiet power of composure and principle. The pilot walked through the aisle briefly, checking on passengers and observing the cabin. His expression was measured, professional, but there was a subtle acknowledgement in his eyes. He had seen the impact of the woman's actions, the way calm authority and fairness could shift a situation entirely. It was a lesson, unspoken but understood, and one he would likely carry forward in his career. The woman remained seated, watching the cabin with quiet attention. Some passengers returned to their devices, while others continued to whisper softly to one another. The energy had shifted from curiosity to admiration. People seemed to recognize that they had witnessed something unusual, a demonstration of integrity, calm, and assertiveness in a situation that could have been tense or uncomfortable. As the plane touched down gently, the subtle hum of engines and the braking system blended with the quiet murmurs of passengers preparing to disembark. The city below grew clearer with every passing second, streets and buildings appearing like miniature versions of themselves from above. The descent marked the conclusion of the flight, but the memory of the events on board would linger far longer. Passengers began to gather their belongings, moving through the aisles in an orderly manner. Some smiled politely at the woman, while others nodded quietly in acknowledgement of the calm strength she had demonstrated. There was no fanfare, no applause, but the appreciation was unmistakable in the soft glances and whispered words. A young woman standing near the exit turned to her companion and said quietly, "I hope she knows how impressive that was." She didn't have to yell or argue, but she made everyone pay attention and respect her. The companion nodded. "Yeah, that was more powerful than any confrontation I've seen. Calm and fair, that's all it took." The woman listened to the quiet comments around her, allowing a subtle sense of fulfillment to settle in. She had not sought recognition, yet it was clear that her actions had created a positive influence. It was a reminder that courage and integrity often speak louder than words, and that standing up for fairness, even in small moments, can leave a meaningful impact. The flight attendants assisted the remaining passengers, their movements efficient and considerate. There was a subtle change in their demeanor, a quiet confidence that had been absent earlier. The woman had influenced more than just the resolution of the seating dispute. She had set an example of calm authority that the crew could carry into future situations. The pilot paused near the cockpit before disembarking, glancing at the woman one last time. There was a subtle acknowledgement in his gaze, a recognition that she had handled the situation with professionalism and composure. He offered a small nod before continuing down the aisle, a silent gesture of respect and understanding. The woman adjusted her bag and rose from her seat, her movements calm and deliberate. As she walked through the aisle toward the exit, she noticed passengers offering polite smiles or nods. Some whispered to one another, recounting her composure and the way she had handled the earlier tension. The recognition was quiet but genuine, a reflection of the impact she had made simply by remaining calm, assertive, and fair. Outside the plane, the sun was warm on her face, and the hum of the airport created a steady rhythm beneath the bustle of arrivals and departures. She moved through the terminal with purpose, aware that the moments on the flight would remain in the minds of those who had witnessed them. The story of her calm authority, her insistence on fairness, and the quiet confidence she had displayed would likely be shared quietly among passengers, leaving a subtle but lasting impression. As she walked through the airport, she reflected on the events of the flight. It had been a small but significant challenge, a moment where calm composure, fairness, and integrity had made all the difference. She felt a quiet pride, not from the acknowledgement of others, but from knowing that she had acted with clarity and purpose. She had faced a situation that could have been uncomfortable or tense, and had turned it into a demonstration of respect, professionalism, and human dignity. Passengers continued to file out of the plane behind her, some still whispering softly to one another. "I hope everyone realizes how rare that was," one said quietly to a companion. She didn't need to raise her voice, and yet everyone respected her. Incredible. The woman made her way to the baggage claim area, her movements unhurried, composed, and purposeful. She did not seek attention or accolades, but she was aware that the memory of her actions had likely already started to ripple through the cabin. Even small gestures, carried out with calm authority, could leave a lasting impression on others. As she retrieved her luggage, she noticed passengers from the flight watching with subtle smiles or nods of acknowledgement. It was a quiet, understated recognition, but it was meaningful. Her actions had shown that integrity, fairness, and composure could shape outcomes more effectively than confrontation or force. It was a lesson that extended far beyond the confines of the plane. She walked through the airport terminal, the energy around her calm and steady. People passed by, busy with their own routines, unaware of the impact of the moment she had created. Yet those who had witnessed the events on the flight carried it with them. A quiet story of authority, fairness, and human dignity. For the woman, the journey had been about more than asserting her seat or demonstrating authority. It had been about holding to her principles, maintaining composure under pressure, and ensuring that fairness was respected. She had faced a situation that could have escalated, and through calm, deliberate action, had transformed it into a moment of quiet influence and respect. The airport echoed with the sounds of arrivals, rolling suitcases and conversations, but the woman moved with purpose, grounded and composed. She had done what was right, and the quiet acknowledgement of passengers, crew, and even the pilot had reinforced the value of acting with integrity and clarity. She paused briefly, taking a deep breath and feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. The memory of the flight, the way she had handled the challenge, and the subtle influence she had created in the cabin lingered. It was a quiet satisfaction, a reminder that courage and fairness, expressed calmly and without aggression, could create lasting impact in even the most ordinary of settings. Passengers continued to pass by, some catching glimpses of her and whispering softly to one another. The story of the flight, the calm authority, the insistence on fairness, the way she had handled the tension without anger or confrontation, was already beginning to take root in their minds. The lessons of that small but significant moment would carry forward, quietly shaping perceptions of composure, respect, and human dignity. As she exited the terminal and stepped into the sunlight, she felt a sense of closure. The flight had ended, but the impact of her actions would persist far beyond those few hours in the air. She had stood firm, asserted her authority, maintained fairness, and demonstrated the quiet power of composure. And in doing so, she had left a lasting impression on everyone who had been aboard. The city stretched out before her, full of possibilities and movement, but she moved through it with calm confidence. The flight had been a test, not of her skills as a passenger, but of her ability to maintain integrity, fairness, and composure under pressure. She had succeeded, not with force or anger, but with quiet strength, and that strength had been recognized, acknowledged, and respected. And as she walked away from the airport, she carried with her the quiet knowledge that standing firm with dignity, asking for fairness, and remaining composed under pressure could create ripples far beyond what anyone could see. The passengers on that flight, the crew, and even the pilot had witnessed it, and their awareness of that moment would linger, a subtle, lasting reminder of the quiet power of integrity and calm authority.